making a video, economics video actually, but I'm going to put it on the inmendham channel just because I'm lazy. So a response video to Nick, Modern Mystic, who's again talking about the reserves, the excess reserves the banks hold. Sorry, this pen. There. So he read some part of a Forbes article that has this chart on it. So this is the difference between loans and deposits, and there's more loans than there are deposits, and somehow people say that's a bad thing, but then when you add the reserves held at the Fed, then the two lines match up again. And it is kind of weird that these two lines match in some sense, in the sense that people keep complaining about fractional reserve banking, and you know, by that diagram, fractional reserve banking hasn't been a problem because for every loan that goes out, a deposit comes in, so everything works out. So anyway, this is the number problem we have. Alright, so we got 4 trillion in cash. Okay, that's how much cash is in the economy. And then 3 trillion of that is in the reserves. Okay, so that's the important reserve one. That's the one locked up at the Fed. Okay, and then there's 1 trillion out in the world. So we use that for out in the world. Out. So there's 1 trillion loose. Alright, these charts, if you remember them, anyway, basically claimed there to be 10 trillion. Yeah, 10 trillion. Let me just leave it like that. In deposits and loans. Okay, that the banks, the commercial banks hold. So right away you have a problem, because if you say there's 10 trillion in deposits or 8 trillion in deposits and some of it's in reserves, the problem is that there's only 4 trillion in cash. So how do you get to 8? How do you get this 8 or 10 trillion? How is it possible to have 8 or 10 trillion dollars of deposits in banks, but there's only 4 trillion in cash? Yeah. So obviously deposit doesn't mean deposit. Deposit means the bank takes out a loan from the public. A deposit is now, these deposits aren't deposits. Okay, they're basically, what the bank is doing is borrowing money from the public and then lending it to somebody else. So it's borrowing in and then lending out. And the money it borrows, it buys stuff with. So what the real number you got to know is, what are the assets held? Assets. That's what you got to know, is what does a bank hold in assets? You know, collateralizing the deposits. So the real problem is there are no real deposit. Deposit is a fake word when the deposit isn't in cash, in my opinion. Right? The word deposit doesn't mean anything anymore if the bank takes in the cash and it doesn't put it in a vault. That's not really a deposit, is it? I don't think so. So what they could be doing, just as a simple rational accounting, would be to take in deposits, you know, borrow money from the public, and then replace the money they borrow with the IOU from the loan they let out. And I guess you could call that what a CD is, a certificate of deposit. Is something like that. So it's a new piece of paper. It's not cash. It's just another piece, it's another IOU that isn't cash. So that's what the whole thing is about, is these IOUs. So I want to read this last paragraph of the article, from the article, and just add context to the words here, because I don't think he was fair to these words. So when it says banks cannot and do not lend out reserves. Obviously they can't lend out something unless they liberate it first. I mean, even if they had the money in the bank vault, they can't lend out the money in the bank vault without taking it out of the bank vault. So in that sense, of course they can't lend out something until they actually convert it into, you know, they have to bring it to the counter and they have to put it across the counter. And essentially what the banks can do at any time is say, give me cash for the IOUs you hold in the reserve accounts. So they can ask the Fed for the cash in their account, and then they can lend it. Alright, anyway. Are deposits for that matter. So just acknowledging that the banks aren't lending out deposits. They're buying things with deposits, apparently. Or they're creating instruments with deposits of some kind. Instruments that might be their loans packaged into some kind of thing, like the IOUs from the loans. I don't know. I mean, but obviously they don't have the cash. The cash is in the economy, $1 trillion of it, and the other cash is in the reserve accounts. There isn't any cash in the banks, which seems a little bit of a problem. And excess reserves cannot and do not crowd out lending. Okay, so the point is if you have a whole bunch of money in the reserve accounts, that somehow the argument's being made that the banks could be lending that. Well, they could lend. Lending doesn't have anything to do with them having cash to lend as long as they are meeting their reserve requirements. The reserve requirements are this big. They have, this big in amount of money in the reserve accounts. So obviously they could be lending. But they're very rarely are they at the minimum of the reserve accounts. There's only a few years here and there when things are really special circumstances where their reserve accounts actually get low enough where it might stifle their ability to lend out money because they can't acquire any cash to lend it out. They're cash poor in their reserve accounts. So lending really has nothing to do with reserve accounts. This is true. But reserve accounts have everything to do with interest rates and inflation and all kinds of stuff like that. Alright, anyway. We are not paying the banks not to lend. Well, technically you're paying the banks to keep money out of circulation. So in a sense yes, you are paying the banks not to lend or not to buy. I mean, I guess as the current system exists, lending and buying are the same thing. Right? Piece of paper comes in that's just an IOU. It's some kind of IOU paper. It's not cash. There's no cash in the bank. The banking system doesn't contain any cash anymore. Anyway, positive interest on excess reserves exists because the banking system is forced to hold the reserves. Okay, now see, that's a lie. Okay, so just as the modern mystics is using this argument to say that the Fed guys are full of shit. That everybody's talking shit. And this article's talking shit, okay? Because the banking system isn't forced to hold these reserves. That's not true, okay? They're forced to hold reserves. They're not forced to hold reserves in 100 times the reserve minimums. They're required to hold a minimum, a tiny minimum. They are 100 times more money in the reserve accounts than they're required to have in the accounts. So it's stupid for this person to say they're forced to hold those reserves. That's not true. The thing that they are being forced, I think, by contract to do is not to cash out of those reserves outside the term of the agreement of the purchases that were done by the banks. The banks bought bonds for the U.S. government. And I think the U.S. government basically put a contingency on those purchases and says those bonds have to be held. Okay, they can't be. They have to be resold on the market by the banks. Let's see, that would force cash in, and they don't want the cash in. No, they have to hold them. Okay, yeah. So the idea is the banks are by obligation can't pull the money out of the reserve accounts until the term of the bonds expires. So if they're 2-year bonds or whatever, then it'd be 2 years. Something like that. To hold those reserves and pay insurance fees. So that would be interesting to know what the hell an insurance fee is for the associated deposits. The associated deposits. Now what does that mean, right? I mean, so you talk about gibberish and nonsense and bullshit. What is that? Okay, so this sentence is just such crap. So I mean, I like the modern mystic. If he's going to defend this article, a Forbes article, Then defend this sentence. What does this mean? Positive interest on excess reserves exists because the banking system is forced to hold those reserves. Okay, that's not true. And pay insurance fees for the associated deposits. What associated deposits? You're talking about the reserve accounts. There's no associated deposit to the reserve account. I mean, the deposits are $10 trillion. The reserve account is $3 trillion. There's no association there that I can find. There's no cash equivalency. There's no direct relationship between deposits and reserve cash. There's no relationship between deposits and cash at all. So explain that to me. It seems only reasonable that they should be paid to do so. So she's defending banks getting billions of dollars to, and all it really comes down to is the interest rate that's being paid on the reserve accounts is basically to encourage banks not to borrow money, but to use the reserve accounts to settle overnight transactions and all that kind of crap. It's some kind of bullshit like that, but it doesn't really have anything to do with anything real. But it does obviously have something to do with paying banks not to cash out, okay, and that you have to somehow compensate for the losses they would incur if that was really their money, because inflation obviously would be killing them, right? If you've got money stuck in a reserve account with the Fed, you know, and it's in cash, American dollars, well then you're losing value based on the stock market or oil or gold or wheat or corn. You know, by almost any measure, you're losing money. So you'd have to compensate for that, for the banks to go for the deal. But they're also getting paid in other ways. They're collecting fees for buying and selling the bonds for the Fed, and that's the other gimmick here, is they're getting paid to do that. A service fee of who knows what. So anyway, so that's why this whole thing doesn't mean anything. Okay, this idea of a deposit is a lie. Okay, these are not deposits. There is not $10 trillion of cash in these banks. If you add up their reserves and you add up the cash, it doesn't come to $10 trillion. So it's not cash. So somehow those deposits have been converted into some other note, some other form of equity. And that would be the interesting thing, is to find out what kind of paper is backing all of this stuff, because it's not cash money. It's something else. It's some other form of IOU. Now bonds, American bonds might be doing it. I mean, there's almost 20 trillion of those, so it certainly would be more than enough to cover these commercial banks. But these are, you know, this isn't international banking, so a lot of those bonds are held in foreign banks and whatnot. I imagine this is commercial bank deposits for the United States, I would imagine. It says U.S. recessions are on these. Those are U.S. recessions. It doesn't say anything about commercial banks international or commercial banks American, but one assumes American. So anyway, but what are these notes that are out in the world? I mean, we know there's, you know, whatever, 500 trillion in derivatives, which are just notes of notes of notes of notes. So all those will resolve out to something. So they're collateralized by something. And the real liability underlying it might be, I don't know, 50 trillion. I don't know what the real, when you just take out the bullshit thing, like the I owe you 50, you owe me 50, I owe you 50, you owe me 50, I owe you 50. You know, in the end there's some leftover 50. Somebody owes somebody 50, but there's no point in counting every $50 exchange. So all of that paper would resolve into somebody owing somebody 50 bucks, not $5,000. So even though it adds up to 5,000 in liabilities, a lot of the liabilities cancel out, so they don't mean anything. I mean, that's how bad this has gotten in terms of how convoluted it is. I mean, what are the real liabilities versus the contrived, created instruments of banks where they've basically just said, I owe you 50, you owe me 50, and pretend they each have a liability of $50 that they don't have, but they're just using it for bookkeeping purposes. Yeah, the fake loans. Yeah. So anyway, it's all very deceptive. Deceptive. This probably isn't as complicated as it all ends up turning into, because yeah, these charts don't tell you the truth. This is even though it's a chart and statistically correct, it's not correct because they're using a word, deposit. It doesn't really mean anything. A deposit is basically a reverse loan now. It's not a deposit. It's a loan. The banks are borrowing money cheap from depositors. They're only borrowing it though. Depositors aren't depositing anything. I mean, the deposit isn't being kept as a deposit. And then the banks are using that equity to justify creating loans that's unlimited number of. But there just seems to be a rational correlation between these two, in the sense that the banks aren't irrational, in the sense that they aren't creating a liability that they aren't justifying with an income. So their sources of income are equaling out to their sources of liability, which seems fundamentally rational, depending on what they bought with the asset cash that they are calling deposits, that are no longer deposits but are now in fact some sort of stock, some sort of instrument, some sort of claim, okay, that may or may not be a secure claim. I mean, even if these are government bonds that this cash was converted into, you could argue that even government bonds aren't worth the paper they're written on. I mean, I don't think a 10-year note is going to pay you back the money you paid for it anywhere close to it, because I think that by the time there's 10 years pass, I think there's going to be 100% inflation, and the money you get back is not going to be the money you bought the bond with. It's going to be a crappier money. It's going to be a penny. You're going to get a penny on your dollar if you buy a 10-year bond. So if that's what's backing, if that's what this cash got turned into, that cash got turned into shit, and that's going to be a problem. Yeah. Okay, that's enough.